I didn't come to the park looking for anything. Not conversation. Not connection. Definitely not whatever this would become. I came because my son liked the swings. That was reason enough. "Higher, Papa!" he laughed, his small hands gripping the chains as his legs kicked forward. I leaned into the movement, my palms flat against his sturdy little back, giving him a gentle but firm push. Each time he soared, the autumn wind caught his hair, making him look like he was trying to fly right out of his coat. "I see you, little dragon," I called back, my voice steady despite the dull ache in my shoulders. "Don't fly too high, okay?" Haru giggled, but his attention was quickly diverted. A boy about his age had approached the neighboring swing, a little boy with dark, serious curls and a coat buttoned all the way to his chin. He looked like a miniature porcelain doll, except for the dirt on his knees. He stood there silently, holding the empty swing as if waiting for permission to exist. Then I felt it. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in the atmosphere. A scent, subtle but heavy, drifted toward me on the breeze. It was the smell of cedarwood and cold rain, a sharp, grounding alpha scent that felt like a sudden shadow passing over a sunlit field. I turned my head. He was standing near the edge of the sandbox, several feet away. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that looked expensive but well-worn. He didn't pace or check his phone like the other parents. He simply stood, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the little boy with an intensity that bordered on mournful. This was Minjun. I knew his name because the preschool teachers whispered it. The widower alpha who never spoke at PDA meetings, the one who looked like he carried the world on his shoulders and found it too light compared to his grief. "Papa, look! Jiho is a dragon too," Haru shouted, pointing at the boy next to him. Minjun's gaze shifted from his son to Haru, and then, finally, to me. Our eyes met, and for a second the park vanished. I saw the familiar hollow behind his expression, the ghost of a partner who should have been standing there beside him. I saw the exhaustion he tried to mask with composure. I recognized it because I saw it in my own mirror every morning at 6 a.m. I offered a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't a flirtation. It was a white flag, a silent acknowledgement between two people who were surviving the same shipwreck in different lifeboats. Minjun didn't smile back. He didn't even soften his expression. He just gave a curt, stiff nod and turned his attention back to Jiho. I sighed, leaning back against the swing-set frame once the kids had hopped off to chase each other toward the slide. I wasn't offended. Some people carried their grief like a shield, and alphas were often taught that any crack in the armor was a failure. I knew I looked different to the world. Approachable, stable, the strong Omega who handled the estate and the child-rearing without a hair out of place. But inside I was just as tired. "Papa, Jiho's hungry," Haru said, suddenly appearing at my knee, trailing the little boy behind him. "Can he have a juice box?" I blinked, surprised by the sudden proximity. Jiho stood behind Haru, clutching the hem of Haru's sweater. He looked up at me with wide, soulful eyes that looked exactly like the man by the sandbox. "Of course," I said, my voice softening. I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 juice boxes. I handed one to Haru and knelt down to offer the other to Jiho. "Here you go, sweetheart. Is it okay with your daddy?" I looked up. Minjun had approached, his footsteps silent on the wood chips. Up close, his presence was even more stifling. Not because he was aggressive, but because he was so incredibly still. "You don't have to do that," Minjun said. His voice was a deep baritone, raspy as if he hadn't used it all day. "It's just juice," I replied easily, standing up to meet his height. I kept my scent neutral, comforting. "I'm Seo-jun. My son Haru seems to have drafted your son into his dragon flight." Minjun looked at the children, then back at me. The corner of his jaw tightened. "I'm Minjun. I appreciate the gesture." He didn't move to take the boy away. He didn't join me on the bench nearby. He just stood there, a foot away, smelling of winter and solitude, while our children sat at our feet, sharing a snack in the fading golden light. For the first time in 3 years, the silence of the park didn't feel quite so empty. The following Tuesday, it happened again. Then the Friday after that. It wasn't planned, but our sons had developed a sort of magnetic pull toward one another. Haru was the spark, bright, loud, and relentlessly cheerful, while Ji-ho was the steady flame, quiet and observant. They balanced each other in a way that made my heart ache with a bittersweet familiarity. I was sitting in my usual spot, a thick-knit cardigan pulled tight against the late October chill, when Minjun appeared. He didn't say hello. He simply sat down on the far end of the same bench. There was exactly enough space between us for a third person, a physical manifestation of the boundaries he lived by. He talked about the juice box papa all weekend, Minjun said abruptly. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the boys as they struggled to build a mountain in the sandbox. I let out a soft, surprised huff of air. The juice box papa? I suppose there are worse titles to have. He doesn't usually talk to strangers, Minjun continued, his voice low. He's cautious, like his mother was. The mention of her hung in the air like a delicate frost. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged the ghosts. I felt a pang of empathy so sharp it made my fingers twitch. I knew that specific type of caution. It was the legacy of a child who had seen a pillar of their world crumble and now walked as if the ground might give way again. Haru is the opposite, I said gently. He's a hurricane. He thinks the world is a giant birthday party he was personally invited to. His father used to say he'd try to befriend a brick wall if it stood still long enough. Minjun's hands, resting on his knees, tightened slightly. How long? 3 years, I replied. A car accident. 1 minute he was texting me about picking up milk, and the next, the world just stopped. I didn't look for pity. I didn't want it. I just wanted to offer him a piece of the truth, a trade for the mention of his wife. Minjun finally turned his head. His eyes were a dark, stormy gray, etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. 4 years for us. Complications. He never got to meet her. The he was Ji-ho. My breath caught. To lose a partner while welcoming a child, that was a special kind of hell. It meant every milestone the child reached was a reminder of what the other person was missing. I'm sorry, Minjun, I whispered. He didn't acknowledge the sympathy, but he didn't pull away either. We sat in a heavy, shared silence for a long time watching our sons. Haru was currently trying to show Ji-ho how to properly jump off the bottom of the slide, gesturing wildly with his small arms. You're doing a good job, I said, the words slipping out before I could census them. He's a sweet, well-mannered boy. You're raising him well. Minjun looked away, his jaw working. I'm just keeping him alive, Seo-jun. Most days, that feels like the limit of my capabilities. Sometimes that's the bravest thing we can do, I countered. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small container of homemade apple muffins. I'd spent the morning baking to keep my mind off the looming legal emails from my late husband's parents, the ever-present vultures circling the inheritance. I held the container out toward the space between us. Try one. They're still a little warm. Minjun hesitated, his gaze flickering to the container and then to me. I saw the internal battle, the alpha instinct to remain self-sufficient versus the human need for a moment of kindness. Slowly, he reached out, his large, calloused fingers brushing against mine as he took a muffin. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the cold air. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and then closed his eyes. For a fleeting moment, the tension in his shoulders dropped. It's good, he admitted, his voice sounding a little less like gravel. Better than the protein bars I usually have for dinner. Is that a cry for help? I teased, keeping my tone light to mask the way my heart was suddenly hammering. A ghost of a smile, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth, appeared. Maybe. Papa. Papa. Look. Haru came sprinting toward us, Jiho trailing just behind him, looking unusually animated. Haru skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with a 5-year-old's epiphany. Jiho says he doesn't have a papa at home. Just a daddy, Haru announced, pointing at Minjun. Then he turned his beaming face to Jiho. It's okay. You can share mine. My papa is the best at cuddles. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the heat climb up my neck, my face flushing a deep crimson. I looked at Minjun, expecting him to be horrified, or perhaps angry at the intrusion into his private grief. But Minjun wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Jiho, who was watching Haru with a look of pure, unadulterated hope. Is that okay, Daddy? Jiho asked in a tiny, fragile voice. Can I share? Minjun's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He looked at me, his gaze searching, vulnerable in a way that made me want to reach out and steady him. I think, Minjun said, his voice thick, that would be up to the juice box papa. I looked down at the two boys, then back at the man who looked like he was holding his breath. I forced a soft, shaky laugh. I think I have enough cuddles to go around. Jiho's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen yet. He didn't run to me, he was too shy for that. But he stepped closer, his small hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of my cardigan. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long purple shadows across the grass, the distance between Minjun and me on the bench seemed to shrink, just a little. The cold didn't feel quite so biting anymore. The transition from the man at the park to the man in my kitchen happened with the quiet stealth of a rising tide. It started on a rainy Tuesday. The clouds had opened up just as preschool let out, turning the sky into a bruised, weeping purple. I had already managed to get Haru into his car seat, the click of the buckle sounding like a small victory against the downpour. I was just about to close the door and hop into the driver's seat when I heard a frantic, high-pitched shout. Papa! Papa, wait! I froze, my hand on the door handle. I turned to see Jiho sprinting across the wet asphalt, his little yellow rain boots splashing through puddles. Behind him, Minjun was mid-stride, his long charcoal overcoat billowing. He had clearly been headed toward his own idling black sedan, but his son had other plans. Jiho didn't stop until he reached me, his small hands clutching the damp fabric of my trousers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and brimming with tears, his lower lip trembling with a desperate sort of conviction. I want to go with Papa, he sobbed, his voice small but piercing. I don't want to go to the big house. I want the space station story. Minjun arrived a second later, breathless in a way I'd never seen him. To the world, he was the untouchable CEO of Kong Industries, a man who navigated billion-1 mergers without breaking a sweat. But here, in the rain, he looked completely undone by his son's sudden rebellion. Jiho, no, Minjun said, his voice low but firm, though his eyes were frantic. We're going home. Mr. Kim is waiting in the car. No, Jiho wailed, burying his face in my hip. Haru, never one to miss a moment of drama, unbuckled himself and leaned out of the car door. Jiho, come in. We have the glow-in-the-dark stars. Minjun looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the corporate armor shattered. I saw the exhaustion of a man who worked 16-hour days only to come home to a house that felt more like a museum than a home. He was a titan of industry, but he was losing a negotiation with a 5-year-old who just wanted to feel a little less lonely. Minjun, I said, shielding Jiho from the wind with my own coat. He's clearly not going to let go. Bring him to our house for dinner. You can take your calls from my study, it's quiet, and the fiber is fast. It's better than a heartbreak in the back seat of a sedan. He paused, the rain flecking his dark hair. I saw the executive calculating the efficiency of the offer against the widower's instinct to retreat. Then he looked at Jiho, who was looking up at me with such raw, hopeful dependence that it made my chest ache. "If you're sure, Seo-jun," Minjun murmured, his voice sounding a little like gravel. "I'll stay until the space station is finished." An hour later, my home smelled of ginger, garlic, and the damp scent of drying wool. "You don't have to cook for us," Minjun said. He was standing in the doorway of my kitchen, his tailored shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked capable of carrying any burden. He looked far too large for the space, a man used to glass offices now contained by my modest, warm yellow walls. I was already making stew. "Adding 2 more bowls isn't a chore," I replied, stirring the pot. From the living room, the sounds of giggles and crashing blocks drifted in. Minjun moved closer, leaning against the counter. His presence was a physical weight, a grounding alpha hum that made the back of my neck tingle. "I feel like I'm intruding," he murmured. "I know how hard you work to maintain this." I finally looked at him, leaning my hip against the island. "Minjun, look at this house. There is no peace here. There's just life. You're not intruding. You're just part of the noise for a night." Watching Minjun sit opposite me at the table later, his large hands carefully maneuvering the ceramic bowl, felt like a puzzle piece clicking into a slot I'd forgotten existed. We didn't talk about business. We talked about the quiet things, the way the boys both hated broccoli, the difficulty of finding shoes that stayed tied. "Papa," Haru asked, wiping a smudge of broth from his lip, "can Jiho stay for a sleepover?" I caught Minjun's eye. For a second, the CEO mask slipped, leaving only the father who was terrified of getting too close to someone else's light. "Not tonight, honey," I said gently. "But maybe they can come over for breakfast on Saturday? I make blueberry pancakes." Jiho's eyes widened. "With the blue circles?" "With lots of blue circles," I promised. Minjun cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to his bowl. "We shouldn't. Your time is valuable, Seo-jun. I know your schedule is packed with the estate." "Minjun," I said, my voice low and firm. I waited until he looked up. "I like the company. Don't treat a pancake like a merger. Just come." He stared at me for a long beat. The reserved, controlled alpha was still there, but beneath the surface, the ice was cracking. "Saturday, then," he said, the words barely a whisper. As I helped them into their coats later, Jiho suddenly surged forward and wrapped his arms around my waist. It was a quick, shy squeeze. "Bye-bye, Papa," he whispered into my sweater. I froze, my breath hitching. I looked up at Minjun. He was looking at me with a gaze so intense, so filled with a burgeoning, terrifying hope, that I had to look away. "Good night, Seo-jun," he said, his voice reaching a depth that resonated in my chest. "Good night, Minjun." I closed the door and leaned against it. The house didn't feel empty anymore. Felt like it was waiting. Saturday morning arrived with a pale, tentative sun that barely managed to cut through the autumn mist. My kitchen was a battlefield of flour and blueberry juice, but for the first time in 3 years, I didn't mind the mess. There was a rhythmic, heavy knock at the door at exactly 9 a.m. Minjun was a man of corporate punctuality, even for pancakes. When I opened the door, I found him standing there with Jiho perched on his hip. Minjun looked slightly less like a CEO today, dressed in a soft navy sweater and dark jeans, though he still carried that aura of controlled power. In his free hand, he held a box from an expensive bakery and a bouquet of white lilies. "You didn't have to bring anything," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "My mother taught me never to show up to a host's home empty-handed," Minjun replied, his voice low. He handed me the flowers, his fingers lingering against mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. And Jiho insisted on picking the bread. "Papa, the blue circles." Jiho scrambled down from his father's arms and ran straight for the kitchen, where Haru was already waiting with a spatula he wasn't allowed to use. "Go on. Help Haru set the napkins," I told the boys, watching them disappear into a whirlwind of giggles. Minjun followed me into the kitchen, looking around with that same curious, slightly wistful expression. It smells incredible in here. It's just sugar and butter, Minjun, the universal language of childhood. I gestured to the stool at the island. Coffee? I have a French press ready. He sat, his large frame making my kitchen island look like dollhouse furniture. As I poured the coffee, I noticed him staring at a stack of legal documents tucked away on the far end of the counter. Correspondence from my late husband's parents. I had tried to hide them, but Minjun's eyes were trained to spot a legal heading from across a boardroom. Is everything all right, Seo-jun? He asked, his tone shifting into something more professional, more protective. Those look like probate inquiries, or custody letters. I sighed, leaning against the counter and gripping my own mug. I shouldn't have been surprised. Minjun knew the smell of a legal shark. Daehyun's parents. They've been quiet for years, but now they've decided they want a larger stake in the trust one manage for Haru. They're threatening a custody challenge to gain leverage over the inheritance. The air in the room seemed to chill. Minjun's expression didn't just harden. It turned predatory. It was the look he surely gave competitors before he crushed them. They won't succeed, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Inheritance law in this district is rigid, and you are a devoted parent. If they try to use the child as a bargaining chip for money. He stopped, his jaw tight. It's repulsive. I can handle them, I said, my voice steady. I've kept the records. I'm not a helpless omega, Minjun. I know my rights. I know you do, he said, and for the first time, I saw genuine admiration in his eyes. But you shouldn't have to stand in that wind alone. We were interrupted by a loud thump from the living room, followed by the boys' laughter. The tension broke, and Minjun's shoulders relaxed slightly. The breakfast that followed was loud and chaotic. We sat at the small table, and for a moment, the CEO and the estate manager disappeared. We were just two parents trying to stop a blueberry syrup catastrophe. After the boys had exhausted themselves and settled in front of a cartoon, a heavy quiet settled over the kitchen. Minjun helped me clear the plates, his movements efficient. We stood side by side at the sink, the steam from the hot water rising between us. Minjun, I whispered, not looking up from the plate I was scrubbing. Do you ever feel like you're betraying her? When you're happy? Even for a second. The clink of the silverware stopped. I felt him turn toward me. Every day, he admitted. The honesty in his voice was raw. The first time I laughed after the funeral, I felt like I'd committed a crime. I felt like I was erasing her. I looked up then. His eyes were shadowed with that familiar, haunting guilt. You aren't replacing the love you lost, I said, reaching out a damp hand to touch his forearm. You're just growing a new garden in the space that was left behind. It doesn't mean the first one didn't matter. Minjun stared at my hand on his arm. Then slowly, he covered my hand with his own. His palm was warm, solid, and incredibly steady. I haven't felt warm in a long time, Seo-jun, he murmured. He leaned in just an inch, and for a second I thought he might kiss me. My heart raced, a frantic bird against my ribs. But he didn't. He simply leaned his forehead against mine. A quiet, domestic bridge of shared grief and budding comfort. We stayed like that for a long time. The only sound the muffled cheers of the cartoon in the other room and the steady beat of two hearts finding a rhythm they thought they'd forgotten. The afternoon stretched long and lazy after breakfast. The boys had migrated to the den, buried under a mountain of pillows and blankets, eventually succumbing to a food coma induced by far too many blueberry pancakes. Minjun and I stood at the threshold of the room watching them. Haru's arm was thrown haphazardly over Jiho's shoulder. They looked like two halves of a whole, finally at rest. I've never seen him sleep so soundly away from home, Minjun whispered, his voice barely a vibration in the quiet hallway. Safety is contagious, I replied softly. We retreated to the kitchen to finish the last of the cleaning. There was something strangely intimate about the domesticity of it. Minjun drying the heavy ceramic bowls I handed him, our movements falling into a natural, wordless sync. But the weight of our earlier conversation lingered, and with the children asleep, the house felt smaller, the air thicker. As I reached up to put a platter on a high shelf, my foot slipped slightly on a stray drop of soapy water. I didn't fall, but I stumbled back. In an instant, Minjun was there. His hands caught my waist, steadying me with a strength that was both jarring and profoundly grounding. He didn't let go immediately. His palms were large, the heat of them seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Careful," he murmured. He was standing so close I could smell the cedar and the faint, lingering scent of the coffee we'd shared. I turned in the circle of his arms, my back pressing against the edge of the counter. Up close, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes seemed softer, but his gaze was intense, searching mine with a hunger he usually kept locked behind a boardroom scowl. "I've got you," he added, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly register that made my skin prickle. "I know," I breathed. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. You're very good at catching things, Minjun." His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. The reserved CEO was warring with the alpha, and for the first time the alpha was winning. He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned in, his shadow eclipsing the kitchen light. "Seo-jun," he said, my name sounding like a prayer and a confession all at once. "I spent 4 years building walls. I thought if I made them high enough I'd be safe. That Jiho would be safe. And now," I asked, my voice trembling. "And now I realize I just built a cage," he whispered. He reached up, his thumb brushing tentatively along my cheekbone. "You make me want to open the door." I reached up, my fingers curling into the soft wool of his sweater. I didn't pull him closer, but I didn't push him away. I just held on, anchoring myself to the reality of him. "It's okay to be afraid. I'm terrified too." He let out a shaky breath, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. We stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, two people defined by what they had lost, finally acknowledging what they might have found. The moment was shattered by the sharp, intrusive chime of my doorbell. I jumped, the spell breaking instantly. Minjun stepped back, his expression snapping back into a mask of cold, professional alertness. He didn't look startled. He looked ready for a fight. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, his voice now a low growl. "No," I said, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. I smoothed my hair and walked to the front door, Minjun following a few paces behind like a silent, dark sentinel. I looked through the side window and felt my blood turn to ice. Standing on my porch were two people dressed in charcoal wool and bitterness. My late husband's parents, the Parks. They weren't alone. A man in a sharp suit stood behind them, clutching a briefcase. "Seo-jun," Mr. Park said as I opened the door just a crack. He didn't look at me. He looked past me into the house he felt he had a claim to. "We've decided that this informal arrangement regarding our grandson's future needs to end. We're here to discuss the terms of his relocation." I felt Minjun step up behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the radiating heat of his protective pheromones. Sharp, cold, and utterly lethal. "You're at the wrong house for a relocation," Minjun said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And you're definitely at the wrong house for a fight." The lawyer stepped forward, but he stopped dead when he caught Minjun's gaze. In the world of business, Minjun was a shark. To these people, he was a nightmare. "And who?" Mrs. Park asked, her voice trembling with indignation. "Are you?" Minjun placed a hand firmly on my shoulder, his grip a silent promise. "I'm the person who's going to make sure you never set foot on this porch again." The silence that followed Minjun's declaration was brittle. The park stared at him, their indignation warring with the sudden, sharp realization that the lonely Omega they intended to bully was no longer standing alone. "This is a family matter," Mr. Park hissed, recovering some of his venom. He adjusted his glasses, trying to look down his nose at me. "Seo-jun, you are overstepping. You've been living off the grace of our son's legacy for 3 years. We have a right to ensure Haru is raised in a proper environment, not whatever this is." His eyes flicked disdainfully to Minjun's hand on my shoulder. I felt the familiar flare of panic in my chest, the old fear that they could actually take him. But then I felt the steady, grounding pressure of Minjun's grip. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing my expression into the professional mask I wore when managing the estate's portfolios. "The proper environment for Haru is with his father," I said, my voice cool and unwavering. "And as for the legacy, I have grown the trust by 15% since Daehyun's passing. Every cent is accounted for and protected. If you want to discuss terms, you can do so through my legal counsel on Monday morning. But you will not stand on my porch and threaten me." The lawyer behind them cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He clearly recognized Minjun. "Mr. Kong, I didn't realize you were involved in this matter." "I am now," Minjun said. He stepped forward, subtly forcing them back a half step. He didn't raise his voice, which made him infinitely more terrifying. "I know your firm, Choi, and I know your clients have no standing for a custody claim unless they can prove negligence. Looking at this home, and knowing Seo-jun's reputation, you'll be laughed out of court." Minjun leaned in slightly, his scent darkening, the cedarwood turning to the smell of a brewing storm. "If you persist in harassing him, I will personally ensure that every predatory business loan the Park Group holds is called in by the end of the week. Do I make myself clear?" Mrs. Park gasped, her face pale. That's illegal. You can't interfere with. I'm an alpha protecting my own," Minjun interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Watch me." The "my own" sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. It was a claim, visceral and ancient, layered beneath the cold business threat. "Leave," I said, finding my own strength in the wake of his. "Now." They retreated. The lawyer practically pulled them toward their car, sensing that the atmosphere had turned lethal. I watched until their taillights vanished around the corner, and then the adrenaline left me all at once. I leaned against the doorframe, my knees feeling like water. Minjun closed the door and locked it with a decisive thud. He turned to me immediately, his eyes frantic with a concern that didn't match the cold man who had just stood on the porch. "Seo-jun, are you okay?" "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been so aggressive. Thank you," I whispered, cutting him off. I looked up at him, my vision blurring slightly. I've been fighting them in polite emails for years. I forgot what it felt like to have someone just stand in front of me. Minjun didn't say a word. He reached out, his movements hesitant, and pulled me into his arms. This wasn't like the kitchen. This wasn't a moment of tension or heat. It was a sanctuary. He wrapped his arms around me, tucking my head under his chin, his large frame acting as a literal shield against the world outside. "They won't come back," he murmured into my hair. "I'll have my legal team draft a restraining order and a formal warning tonight. They won't touch you. Or Haru. You don't have to do all that, Minjun. I can handle the legal side. I trailed off, leaning into his warmth. I just needed a minute to breathe. "Take all the minutes you need," he whispered. We stayed there in the foyer for a long time, the only sound the distant, muffled snoring of 2 little boys in the den. I could feel the steady, powerful thrum of Minjun's heart against my ear. It was a rhythm of safety, of a shared burden made lighter. For the first time since the accident, the house didn't feel like a fortress I had to defend alone. Felt like a home. And the man holding me didn't feel like a stranger or a merger partner. He felt like the air I had been forgetting to breathe. The house was silent again, but the air felt charged, vibrating with the aftermath of the confrontation. Minjun hadn't let go, and I found I didn't want him to. My face was pressed against the soft wool of his sweater, inhaling the scent of him, now calming, the sharp edge of his protective pheromones fading back into that soothing cedar and rain. I should go check on them, I whispered against his chest, though I made no move to pull away. They're fine, Minjun murmured, his hand moving in slow, grounding circles on my back. I can hear them. Jiho talks in his sleep when he's happy. He's currently mumbling about star fuel. I let out a shaky laugh, finally pulling back just enough to look at him. His eyes were dark, searching my face for any lingering traces of distress. The CEO was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had just rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever. I'm sorry you had to see that, I said, smoothing the front of my shirt. The parks, they can be very loud. I've dealt with hostile takeovers, Seo-jun. They were just bullies. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was so light, so cautious, as if I were something fragile that might shatter. But you were incredible. You stood your ground before I even opened my mouth. I had to, for Haru. I looked down at my hands. But having you there, it made the ground feel solid again. We wandered back into the kitchen. The tea I'd made earlier was cold, so I moved to start the kettle again, needing something for my hands to do. Minjun didn't sit at the island this time. He followed me, standing close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Seo-jun, he said softly. I turned, the kettle forgotten in my hand. I came to the park because Jiho liked the swings, he began, his voice low and steady, echoing my own thoughts from weeks ago. But I kept coming back because I liked the way you looked at the world, like it was something worth being part of again. My heart skipped a beat. Minjun, I'm a reserved man. I know I'm difficult. I know I carry too much silence. He took a step closer, his hands finding mine and gently taking the kettle to set it on the counter. He held my hands in his thumbs brushing over my knuckles. But when I'm here, in this house with you, the silence doesn't feel like a weight. It feels like peace. I looked up at him, my breath hitching. I felt the same. I thought I was fine being alone. I thought I was strong enough to do everything by myself. But I was so tired. You don't have to be tired anymore, he whispered. He leaned in, and this time, there were no doorbells, no children waking up, no ghosts in the room. His lips met mine in a kiss that was slow, tentative, and deeply, achingly sweet. It tasted of coffee and shared secrets, of grief being traded for hope. It wasn't the fiery, demanding kiss of a dominant alpha. It was a promise, a soft, domestic anchor thrown into the sea. I melted into him, my eyes fluttering shut as I finally let the last of my defenses crumble. For years, I had been the one holding everything together. Now, in the quiet of my kitchen, I let Minjun hold me. When we finally pulled apart, we were both a little breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual composure. Transformed his face, making him look younger, softer. Saturday breakfast might have to become a permanent fixture, he murmured. I think the boys would stage a coup if it didn't, I replied, leaning my weight into him. The weight of the legal battle still loomed, and the shadows of our past partners would always be there, tucked into the corners of our lives. But as I stood there in the circle of his arms, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting what we'd lost. It was about finding the courage to love what we had found. Stay, I asked, the word small but heavy with meaning. Just until they wake up. We can watch the rest of the cartoons together. Minjun squeezed my hands, his eyes reflecting the soft afternoon light. I'm not going anywhere, Seo-jun. Not today. Not ever, if you'll have me. The transition from a solitary existence to a shared life is rarely a thunderclap. It is a series of quiet shifts, like the tide reclaiming a dry shore. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation on the porch. The legal firestorm I had expected never materialized. True to his word, Minjun's legal team had descended with the surgical precision of a hawk. The Parks had been served with a cease and desist so comprehensive it practically forbade them from thinking in our direction. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest, the constant low-level dread of what if, had evaporated. It was a Tuesday evening, and the house was filled with the low hum of a domesticity I was still learning to trust. Minjun was in my study. The door cracked open. I could hear the rhythmic, low rumble of his voice as he conducted a late-night board meeting with London. Even in a soft sweater and lounge pants, his authority was unmistakable. But every few minutes, the corporate jargon would stop, followed by the soft click of a tongue or a muffled HH, as Ji-ho, who had claimed a corner of the rug with his Legos, asked a question about space fuel. I stood in the kitchen, plating fruit for the boys. I felt a presence at my elbow. Papa. I looked down. Haru was standing there, holding a worn-out picture book. He looked at the study door, then back at me. Is Daddy Minjun busy? The Daddy Minjun caught in my throat. It had started a few days ago, a natural evolution of the sharing they had practiced at the park. He's working, honey, I said, kneeling to his level. Why? I want him to read the dragon book, Haru whispered. He does the growly voices better than you. I chuckled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Go ask him. Just be very quiet until he puts the computer away. I watched Haru creep toward the study. Through the gap in the door, I saw Minjun look up from his monitors. The hard, calculating line of his jaw immediately softened. He didn't shoo the boy away. Instead, he reached out an arm, pulling Haru into the crook of his side while he finished his final sentence to a room full of directors. I'll yield the floor to my colleagues, Minjun said into the mic, his eyes on Haru. I have a pressing engagement with a dragon. He shut the laptop. Later that night, after the house had finally fallen into that deep, heavy slumber only children can achieve, Minjun and I sat on the sofa. We didn't turn on the television. We just sat in the dim glow of the floor lamp, a single blanket draped over both of our laps. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. You're getting too good at those dragon voices. I'm losing my status as the favorite storyteller. Minjun shifted, his arm tightening around me, pulling me closer until there was no air between us. I think your status is secure, Seo-jun. Ji-ho asked me today if we could live here forever, because the air smells like your tea. I smiled into the darkness. What did you tell him? I told him that was the most logical proposal I'd heard all year, Minjun murmured. He turned his head, his lips brushing my temple. The park's lawyers called my office today. They're dropping the claim entirely. They realized that attacking you meant attacking the Kong Group's entire legal apparatus. I hate that it took a billionaire's shadow to make them stop. I admitted, my voice dropping. But I'm grateful for the peace. It wasn't just the shadow, Seo-jun, Minjun said, his voice firm. They saw that you weren't a solitary target anymore. They saw a family. People like that only prey on the isolated. He reached for my hand under the blanket, interlacing our fingers. His palm was warm, and his thumb traced the line of my wrist where my pulse was steady and calm. I used to think my life was a finished book, I whispered. I thought I was just writing the epilogue for Haru. And now, I looked up at him. The moonlight caught the sharp edge of his cheekbone and the sudden, profound softness in his eyes. Now, I said, it feels like I'm only halfway through chapter 1. Minjun didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply leaned down and captured my lips in a kiss that tasted like the future. Quiet, steady, and inevitable. The weeks bled into a month, and the transition of Minjun's presence from guest to fixture became absolute. It was no longer a question of if they would be over, but rather which shoes belonged to which boy by the front door. Yet, despite the ease of our days, a soft, lingering melancholy still drifted through the house on occasion. Not a sad ghost, but a quiet one. We were two people who had mastered the art of holding back, and though our hearts were intertwined, there was one final threshold we hadn't quite crossed. We hadn't talked about the after in a way that involved moving boxes and shared keys. I was in the kitchen, preparing a late Sunday lunch, when I heard the heavy, rhythmic sound of Minjun's footsteps. He didn't come in with his usual composed stride. He stopped in the doorway, watching me as I kneaded dough for fresh bread. "You're doing that thing again," he said, his voice a low vibration in the small room. "What thing?" I asked, not looking up, though my face warmed. "The thing where you work with your hands when you're thinking too hard. Your scent is like rain-heavy jasmine today, Seo-jun. It's lovely, but it's anxious." I stopped, my hands covered in flour. I finally looked at him. He had his sleeves rolled up, revealing the strong, corded muscles of his forearms. He looked so much like he belonged here that it physically hurt. "I was just thinking about the boys," I lied, though it was only a half-truth. "They're getting so close. Jiho cried this morning because he didn't want to go back to the big house to get his school bag. He said this is the warm house." Minjun walked over, closing the distance until he was standing directly behind me. He didn't touch me at first, just let his heat wrap around my back. "It's the warm house for me, too," he murmured. He reached around, his large, clean hands gently covering my flour-dusted ones on the counter. I spent the morning looking at the black sedan, the driver, the glass office, and I realized I don't want to go back to being the man who lives there. I want to be the man who lives here. My breath hitched. "Minjun, your life is huge. Your company, your responsibilities. Those are things I do," he interrupted, turning me around in the circle of his arms. He didn't mind the flour staining his expensive sweater. "This you, Haru, the way Jiho laughs when you tuck him in. This is who I am, or who I want to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart stopped, but when he opened it, it wasn't a ring. It was a key, a heavy, brass key with a small, hand-painted wooden tag that said Jiho's room. "I bought the property adjacent to yours," he whispered. "The old orchard lot. I'm having a house built, one that connects to this one through a shared garden. So the boys never have to say goodbye at the end of a playdate. And so I, if you'll let me, can be home every night." Tears pricked my eyes. It was such a Minjun gesture, strategic, protective, and overwhelmingly generous. He wasn't trying to replace my home or erase my past with Daehyun. He was building a bridge. "You're building a house?" I choked out, a laugh bubbling up through my tears. "Minjun, that's a lot of construction for a maybe." "It's not a maybe for me," he said, his gaze fixed on mine with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. "I've spent my life making investments, Seo-jun. This is the only one that matters." I reached up, my floury hands cupping his face, leaving white streaks on his jaw. "I don't need a new house, Minjun. I just need you. You have me," he breathed, leaning down to press his forehead against mine. "Every reserved, stubborn, overprotective inch of me." We stood there, anchored to each other in the middle of a messy kitchen, as the scent of baking bread and jasmine filled the air. The widowed Alpha and the widowed Omega were gone. There was just Minjun and Seo-jun, two people who had survived the storm and decided to build something permanent in the sunshine. From the garden, we heard the boys shouting, "Papa! Daddy! Look, we found a toad!" Minjun smiled, a real, bright smile that reached his eyes. "I suppose we should go see this toad." "I suppose we should," I agreed, slipping my hand into his. The key sat on the counter, a golden promise of a life where no one had to be alone in the dark anymore. We walked out into the light together. The construction on the orchard lot was surprisingly quiet, or perhaps I simply didn't mind the sound of progress. Over the months, the physical bridge Minjun had promised began to take shape. Not a towering wall, but a low, stone-lined path that wound through a shared garden of peonies and hardy evergreens. It was a physical manifestation of our lives. Two separate histories meeting in a common, flowering middle. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 1 year since the day at the park when a shared juice box had changed everything. I stood on the new cedar deck that connected the two houses, a tray of tea in my hands. The morning air was mild, carrying the scent of damp earth, and the faint, sweet smell of the lilies Minjun still brought me every week. "Papa, watch this." I looked out into the yard. Haru and Jiho were no longer the cautious strangers they had been. They were a blur of coordinated chaos, dressed in matching overalls, racing toward the wooden play structure Minjun had commissioned. It was built like a small fortress, half space station, half dragon's lair, to satisfy every one of their evolving fantasies. "They're going to tire themselves out before breakfast," a deep voice rumbled behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. I felt the familiar, warm weight of Minjun's presence as he stepped onto the deck. He didn't look like the untouchable CEO anymore. He was wearing a soft flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up, his hair slightly tousled by the morning breeze. He looked relaxed, his shoulders finally stripped of the tension that had defined them for years. He slid his arms around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. I leaned into him, the tea tray resting safely on the railing. "Let them," I murmured, tilting my head back to catch his gaze. "A tired dragon is a quiet dragon." Minjun let out a soft huff of laughter, his breath warm against my temple. He rested his chin on my shoulder, watching the boys. "I was looking at the calendar this morning. A year, Seo-jun. It feels like a lifetime, and yet I can barely remember the silence that came before you." "I remember it," I said softly, reaching up to cover his hands with mine. "But it feels like a different book, one I've put back on the shelf." Minjun turned me in his arms, his expression becoming serious, though his eyes remained soft. He reached into his pocket, not for a key this time. He pulled out a simple, elegant band of brushed platinum. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was solid, enduring, and quiet. "I know we have our ghosts," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know we've both survived things that should have broken us. But I don't want to just be the man in the house next door. I want to be the man who wakes up beside you for the next 50 years. I want to be the alpha who keeps your world warm." He didn't ask a question. The proposal was in the way he looked at me, with a total, unshielded vulnerability that a man of his stature only showed to his heart's true home. "Yes," I breathed, before he could even find the words. "Always yes, Minjun." He slid the ring onto my finger. It felt right. Not like a replacement for the gold band I had once worn, but like a companion to the life I had built. It was a new promise, etched in the lessons of the old one. He kissed me then, a long, slow seal of our future. It was a kiss that tasted of healing and home. "Papa, Daddy, we're hungry." Haru's voice cut through the air as the two boys skidded to a halt at the base of the deck. Jiho scrambled up the stairs first, his eyes bright. "Is it pancake day? With the blue circles?" Minjun laughed, the sound bright and full, and reached down to hoist Haru onto his shoulders while I scooped up a giggling Jiho. "It's definitely pancake day," Minjun declared, catching my eye over the heads of our children. "The best one yet." We walked into the kitchen together, the Alpha, the Omega, and the two boys who had brought them back to life. The house was loud, messy, and filled with the beautiful, domestic friction of a family that had found its way through the dark. As the sun rose higher, casting long, golden streaks across the shared garden, I realized that love after loss wasn't a miracle. It was a choice to open the door, to share the juice box, and to believe that even after the coldest winter, the earth still knew how to bloom.